Welcome to Dr. Sebastian Gorka.
When you hear Mother Freedom start ringing her bell, and it'll feel like the whole wide world is raining down on you. Oh, brought to you courtesy of the red, white, and blue.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for that very warm welcome. It is so great to be here in this beautiful location and to see so many familiar faces. Kay James, the Sorbos, I think Charlie Kirk and Candice may be around here somewhere. It's wonderful to be invited here to true honor. I'm going to be a little bit different from your breakfast speaker because I like preaching to the choir. And I think the two paid protesters you had last night, I don't think you could have appealed to them even with emotional messages. They weren't there to listen. They weren't there to engage. They were paid to be rabble-rousers. So, as we say in the UK, horses for courses. And I'm going to give you a different type of speech today. But one thing I agree with your morning speaker intimately and very, very deeply on is that one bullet point she had on stories. Everybody loves a story. Whether you're talking to a bushman in the Kalahari Desert, whether you're here in Steamboat Springs, human beings connect to stories. And it's a very, very powerful way to communicate eternal truths. So indulge me for a moment. I'm going to talk about my new book, Why We Fight. I'm sorry it's not outside because we had to allow Sean Spicer to release his book first. So we have the same publisher. But my New York Times bestseller, Defeating Jihad, is here, and I will sign and dedicate copies. And I'd like to take questions and answers from you before I go as well. I'm going to talk about what this country represents, the stakes in November, and because of what I did last year, share a little bit about who Donald Trump, the man, really is. Everybody wants to know what's he really like behind closed doors, and I'm happy to share that with you. But first, a story. Imagine a young boy, 14, walking through the rubble of a burnt-out, bombed-out city. Imagine Syria today, if you will. Yes? 14-year-old boy. It's not the Middle East, it's Europe. And it's 1944. And this young boy is walking through the streets of Budapest. 3 out of every 5 buildings has been bombed. The Nazis have occupied the country, and he doesn't know what his future holds for him. He survives the Nazi occupation. His family survives the war. And finally it ends. And this young boy has hope again for the first time in 6 years. Why? Because he hears that the great men have sat down at Yalta. The victors, the allies, have brought a peace that will give freedom back to the occupied countries of Central Europe. They have assured everybody. Stalin has told Churchill, has told the American president, we will have free democratic elections in the former occupied territories of Central Europe. Are we good? So this young boy has hope. We will be free again. But what happens? As all you history buffs know, within 3 years, this nation that had been under fascist control falls under communist control. By 1948, Stalin had reneged on Yalta. All those governments had been compromised. Democrats, Christians had been persecuted, intimidated. and the Communist Party took over every country. So from fascism to communism, the future was bleak. By now, this young boy was a man. He was 18 years old, and he was just starting college. And he wanted to resist the dictatorship. Not with a gun, not with a bomb, but by undermining it politically from the inside. So as he started college, he found a handful of fellow Christians, true patriots, and he created an underground students' organization that would collect intelligence about what the Soviets were doing in Hungary, the tank movements, the movements of troops, how they were gobbling up the nation's economy to export it back to Russia. And they would somehow ferry out that information surreptitiously to the West, to a democratic nation that could use that intelligence against Moscow and to get these nations to be free once more. And they were successful. They found a courier who connected to British intelligence, to MI6, and they were sending these intelligence reports out to the West, hopefully with the goal of undermining the Soviet domination of Central Europe. The captive nations could be free again. Unbeknownst to that young man, however, there was a fly in the ointment. At the end of that intelligence reporting chain, those reports that they were smuggling out through Vienna to London, sat a man at the heart of MI6, reading those reports, whose name was Kim Philby. If you know your history, Kim Philby is one of the 5 greatest traitors to Western civilization in the 20th century. They are named the Cambridge Apostles, and they were recruited by the KGB when at Cambridge, and they became assets of the Soviet Union at the highest levels of the British government, one of them even becoming, and this is incredible to this day, the Queen's art curator, Anthony Blunt. I mean, this is how they penetrated a British society. So Kim collects the reports, he starts doing the matrix analysis until he can identify every single patriot in that undercover cell, and then he blows their identities to Moscow. Moscow tells the Hungarian police, the secret police, and the students are rounded up, tortured, interrogated, sent to prison. The courier is actually assassinated. Now, why am I telling you? What has this got to do with this beautiful locale, this conference? What has this got to do with Donald Trump and why we fight, the title of my book? Well, it's very personal to me, because that 18-year-old man who received a life sentence at the age of 20 after being tortured by the secret police, that man was called Paul Gorka, and he was my father. That gives me a certain perspective on what this nation represents. And this isn't a criticism of my fellow Americans. I am a proud American now. But there is something that the immigrant to this country sometimes sees perhaps slightly more clearly than those who were blessed by accident of fortune to be born here. And it is what you heard from that incredibly emotional conclusion to your prior speaker. This truly is the greatest nation on God's earth. And for a very specific reason that we'll talk about in a second. So, my father escaped from a communist prison after 6 years, 2 years in solitary, 2 years down a prison coal mine, 2 years in the main political prison in Budapest. He was liberated by the revolutionaries of 1956 that had captured a Soviet tank and went to the prison to liberate their fellow patriots. And with the 17-year-old daughter of a fellow prison mate, he escaped across the minefields into Austria, into a refugee camp. They made it to the UK, were married, and that was my mother, and that's how I was born and raised to Hungarians in the UK. The point of this story is to reinforce what the great Ronald Reagan told us. We could talk for hours about what he did for our country, but one thing that will be burnt on my brain forever is his very simple line. Sooner or later, they will come to take your liberty from you. The loss of liberty, the loss of freedom, is always but one generation away. Whether it's the fascists, the Nazis of World War II, whether it's the Soviet Union and the communists of the Cold War, or whether it's the global jihadists of 9/11, there will always be somebody who wishes to kill or enslave you. And it doesn't have to be with a bomb or a gun. There are Americans who are giving in to this right now. I mean, look at the frightening statistics. According to the Victims of Communism Foundation, an amazing organization in DC, 42% of millennials want to live in a socialist America. 42% of millennials. Despite the fact that if you read your Karl Marx, which I'm sure Ocasio-Cortez has not, yeah, socialism is just the waypoint. It is the transition point to communism. It's not an end in and of itself, it is a waypoint. And communism, as we all know, is perhaps the most destructive ideology the world has ever seen. Hitler was evil incarnate, yes. But according to left-wing historians, you can read all the details, the Black Book of Communism edited by Stephen Courtois. The ideology of socialism and communism cost the lives of more than 100 million human souls in the last century. 100 million snuffed out. I mean, just the footnotes are shocking. Stalin kills 8 million Ukrainians by starving them to death to create utopia. We have the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, Pol Pot, kill 30% of the Cambodian population. 30%. This is socialism. This is communism. So we always have to remind ourselves what the stakes are and how history tends to repeat itself and how we have people who will always come to undermine us. Let me share with you another story. It's very fresh. You don't have to go back in time. You don't have to go back to Europe or World War II. Yesterday, I had the honor to host a national radio show. I was guest hosting for the amazing Salem Radio Network. And I don't know how these guys get paid to do this. You talk for 3 hours and you pick up a paycheck. It's great. It's great. And I had lots of fun. It was going really quickly. And then the last 15 minutes, I get a call from a woman called Mary. And Mary opens by telling me that at the age of 3, her parents escaped with her from Cuba and came to America. And what she's seeing happen now is what she saw happen in Cuba. The emotional attachment to utopian ideologies, such as Bernie Sanders, such as Ocasio-Cortez. And she was very fearful for the president, for the members of his cabinet, and so she should be when you have members of Congress openly calling for the harassment of female members of this administration. Did we ever think we could get there? Did we ever think that this would happen? And my response to her was from the heart. I had no script, I had no talking points, and I'll share it with you. I thanked her for her prayers. I said, please pray for the president and his family and his cabinet. But remember why it is that we are where we are today, why we have this hate-filled attack on who we are. It's for a very simple reason. America was and is and always will be, God willing, a very radical idea. America is a radical idea. Some people call it a religion. I don't buy that. It is a radical idea because what was the American idea born in the Revolutionary War? It was the idea that we will rule ourselves. Wow. At the end of the 18th century, that was radical. That we will not be ruled by some elite, by some dynasty. We won't be defined by some accident of history, that we depend upon an ethnic identity, a linguistic culture, or just who happened to be born king or queen. We will rule ourselves. We are sovereign. Why? Because as the founding documents tell us, And it's fascinating, that list you saw, the one thing the liberals disagreed with, yes? Trust in God. Wow. How ahistoric can you be? Read the founding documents. Dignity of the human being does not come from Washington. Your human rights aren't a function because someone gifted them to you temporarily. If they were, they could take them away from you, as they do in socialist countries, as they are trying to do now. Freedom of speech. Look at what's happening on social media. The idea that at universities you have to have free speech zones. Ladies and gentlemen, the free speech zone in my country, America, is from the Canadian border to the Mexican and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. We have dignity as human beings because, as our founding documents tell us, we are made in the image of our Creator with a capital C. That is why we are sovereign. And this is what most people miss about the president. They look at his policies, the wall, defeating ISIS, the economy, and tariffs. There is a philosophical bedrock to all of it that even the vaunted commentariat of the swamp miss, which isn't a surprise. The principle that undergirds all of those policies is very simple. Sovereignty. Sovereignty. We are a sovereign nation, but the sovereignty of this nation emanates from us as sovereign human beings created in the image of God. That's what MAGA means. Make America great again, by returning to the principles on which it was founded. And it is no accident that human beings will risk swimming across shark-infested waters on homemade rafts trying to escape from Cuba to come here. Why my parents will risk minefields, literally walking across minefields to acquire their freedom. Because there's a very simple metric. When people do that, they're not looking to end up in Belgium. They're not looking to end up in Algeria. When the blind lawyer, the pro-life activist in China, escaped house arrest recently and walked as a blind man to Beijing from his country residence, which embassy's door did he knock on? Not the French, not the German. People only knock on one door for political asylum. It is ours because of what that radical idea is. So, at the end of the day, there will always be those who want power for the sake of power. That is what we see on the left. And my worry today is that we don't have the pragmatists anymore to rein them in. We've always had crazies on the left. Go back to 1968, Chicago Days of Rage, SDS. It's always been there, always. But at some point, somebody on the left will rein in the crazies. I'm no fan of Bill Clinton, but he was a pragmatist, and he could rein in. Who is doing the reining in today? Chuck Schumer's not reining in Maxine Waters, right? It's never going to happen. So that's why November 2018 is perhaps even more important than November 2016. Let me conclude before I take your questions on who the boss is. Everybody wants to know about Donald Trump. What's he really like? It's very easy, very easy. If you've been alive for the last 30 years and you've got a pulse, you know who Donald Trump is. Because what you see in public, what you see on that TV show, what you see in a stadium full of 60,000 supporters, what you see him do every day, that is Donald J. Trump. Behind closed doors, he is exactly the same as he is in public. There is no public persona and private. No, he is what he is. I knew this the first moment I met him. Corey Lewandowski reached out to me in the summer of 15 to help prep candidate Trump on his national security debate for the GOP debates. And I flew to New York, I went to Trump Tower, we met in his office, the future president behind his desk, Corey Lewandowski here, just the three of us, had a wide-ranging discussion on national security from the Civil War to the Middle East and nuclear weapons, you name it. Halfway through the conversation, he stops in mid-sentence, looks at Corey and says, "Yeah, I like this guy, let's hire him." That's the Trump effect. He knows what he wants, he gets it, and he's results-oriented. And going back to the morning speaker, let's talk about how we engage those who don't understand what's really going on. Because what's really going on is the following, and they will not believe you. This is what the left is in a psychological idée fixe. Okay, they're in a fugue. They will not believe what I'm about to tell you about the president. The president of the United States ran for the highest office in the land for two simple reasons. He didn't need the money, okay, that massive government paycheck, and he didn't need the fame, did he? Right? I think he was famous enough. He did it for two reasons. Number one, he wants everybody in America to be safe. That's the wall. That's crushing ISIS. That's making sure MS-13 isn't running around killing people on the streets of America. He wants you all to be safe. And secondly, he wants you all to prosper. Not everybody's going to be a billionaire. This isn't some kind of, planned economy. But he wants to unshackle the American economic engine, which he has to such an extent, it's stunning. More than 4% GDP growth, and we're not even into the second year of his administration. So he wants safety and prosperity for all. But you know what's really shocking for the left? He wants it for you whether you voted for him or not. Right? Whether you voted for Hillary, whether you voted for wanted Bernie to win, whether you sat at home eating potato chips and didn't vote, doesn't matter. If you're an American in America, you get to be safe and you get to have the chance to prosper. I'll give you one metric. Do you remember when we came in, we said that the president isn't going to sign an executive order unless two are rescinded? So we're going to dismantle the, like Gulliver with the Lilliputians tying him down with those little threads. We're going to snip all the threads so that the American economic giant can live again, can breathe. We had a 1-to-2 ratio. By the end of the first year, we were at 1-to-22. The president would not sign an executive order unless 22 had been rescinded. That's why we have $300 billion being repatriated to America right now by American businesses. Not to buy mansions, not to buy supercars, but to do what? Build plants, to provide jobs. That's what Donald Trump wants. And if you're talking to somebody who's not a fan, doesn't like his tweets, or maybe is on the fence, is undecided, take politics out of it. Just take politics out of it. I tell people, ask a very simple question to those people. Ask them, what do you think of the last year and a half? It's a pretty neutral, anodyne question. How do you like the last year and a half? Do you like that you're going to have to adjust your tax returns because the figures you used for the deductions last year are too punitive and you're going to get more money back? Do you like that? Do you like the fact that we have the lowest minority unemployment since record-keeping began from the great bigoted president? Yes? Yeah? And when you hear the crazy fake news lies, the hatred, the white supremacy, the bigotry, the anti-Semitism, don't get on a soapbox and say, something aggressive. Just ask them. You do know that the president's grandchildren are Jewish, right? Orthodox Jewish. You do know that, right? You do know that for 23 years, American presidents, Republican and Democrat, have promised to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the eternal state of Israel, but didn't. I mean, it was like a Monty Python skit. Every 6 months they had to sign a waiver for 23 years. It's nuts. And along comes a man, and I can't divulge names, but a cabinet member told me. Along comes Donald Trump, who says, I'm going to do it, I'm going to move the embassy. And only 3 members of his cabinet supported him. 3 members, because they were afraid. But what did he do? He said, I promised the American people, I promised the people of Israel, oh, and by the way, it is the right thing to do. Our greatest friend in the Middle East, the only true democracy, and finally, relations with Israel are back to where they should be. So just, ask them questions that will hopefully get them to their own Socratically arrived at correct conclusions. Okay, I'm getting a bit carried away. It's always fun. It's always fun to be preaching to the choir. But I promised I'd take some questions and then I'll be outside to sign books. So if you have, this is so fancy when they give it to you on cards. I like the frisson of just asking people to stand up and ask questions. What are my thoughts on Space Force? Space Force, so cool. So cool. I just want really cool uniforms. They've got to be kind of Star Trek, Wrath of Khan. Okay, it's got to be better than the original movie. Funny you ask that. They're actually friends of mine who did the graphic novel version of Clinton Cash. There's actually a graphic novel version. They're now doing a graphic novel on Space Force with the president in it, and you might see some other familiar faces in the comic book as well. So check that out. What is the proper response to the rising threat of China? Wow, superb question. If I had 3 hours, I'd give you the full response. But I'll tell you a personal story. I came into the White House as strategist to the president, predominantly to do counterterrorism issues. But I was a utility infielder on national security, but it was counterterrorism. Once you have the clearances, once you read all the reports that mere mortals don't get to read, you realize we'll beat the jihadis easy. We'll deal with Russia, we'll deal with North Korea, we'll deal with everybody else, Iran included. But America only faces one strategic threat, and it is China. This isn't classified, you can Google it right now. China has an overt plan to displace America by the 100th anniversary of the Communist Revolution of China. So 2049. By 2049, America will be irrelevant. And China is building a capacity to do that. It is called the One Belt, One Road strategy. One Belt, One Road. And they are building a global web of economic means, military means, intelligence means to undermine America. Good news is, the president gets it. We gave him a series of classified briefings where he understands that our greatest enemy today is China, and that's why you're seeing him take the steps that he's taking. So don't worry. No, seriously, don't worry. Look, we are the greatest nation on God's earth. We are. And I don't know which God you pray to, okay? I'm a mackerel-snapping Catholic myself. And I will never forget November the 9th, the morning of November, the election 2016. I don't know about you, but I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my porch with my teenage son with our laptops open, watching the returns come in. At 10, when Brett Baer said, well, it may be too hard to call tonight, maybe we have to wait till tomorrow, I got very worried. I said, Brett, don't do it. If we can't call it tonight, there's going to be some hanky-panky at 4 a.m., with those ballot boxes, okay? But it was a joyous moment when you start the evening watching the New York Times barometer for the election with Hillary at 94%, and then over the next 6 hours, it goes to 0. So I don't know what your vision of the supreme being is. I don't care if you pray to the purple spaghetti-eating dragon. But I'll tell you one thing. November the 8th, 2016 is proof that God exists. My opinion on the probability of a popular uprising in Iran and its chances of success. Prediction is a mug's game because nobody holds you to it. When you make a prediction, nobody goes back a year later when you got it wrong and said, ha-ha, right? So I don't do predictions. What I will tell you is what's happening now in Iran is very different from the Green Revolution of '09 that Obama completely ignored. And in fact, he facilitated the mullahs after with the Iran deal. Why? Because back then the demonstrations were mostly centralized and the Iranian economy was much stronger. Now, 9 years later, the Iranian economy is in deep, deep trouble because of their adventurism abroad in Yemen, in Iraq, and elsewhere. The currency is collapsing, and the demonstrations are happening everywhere across Iran. Now, do they have a chance? At the end of the day, you've got to be like Stalin when he was asked about the Pope. He said, how many tank divisions does the Pope have? The issue here is who has the guns. Who has the guns? Who has the tanks? It's the Republican Guard. If somebody can split elements of the Republican Guard off, as happened in Hungary in 1956, where soldiers would actually give their weapons to the revolutionaries, anything is possible, and Persia could rise again in a good way. But there's no way to predict how much that is likely to occur, but the regime is in big, big trouble. How can you stop MSNBC, CNN? with a footnote, besides changing channels. Well, look, we're conservatives, so we believe in the free market, so you don't stop the free market. You don't stop the free market. But the free market is not libertarianism. Sorry guys. Libertarianism misunderstands capitalism. Because you've got to read Michael Novak. You've got to read Milton Friedman. Capitalism must have a moral content. A moral content. It's not just profit. My family, my wife's family, is the oldest steel manufacturing company in America. And my wife wrote the history of the company, published the book. It's Cornell Iron Works. And she was going through the ledgers in the 30s, and it's stunning. Her family, her great-great-grandfather, took no salary for the decade of the 30s as the president of the company. Why? Because if he took a salary, he couldn't make payroll. That's not a libertarian ideal, but that's capitalism in the original sense with a moral compass. So we don't go in and then try and control media. That's not the way we do it. The market forces should dictate certain results. Do you have any idea how many people watch my friend Sean Hannity every night? It's the biggest show in cable news, the biggest, perennially. Between 4 and 5 million. When we were in Singapore, it was, I think, pushing 5 million. So 4 or 5 million. Do you know how many people watch the darling star of CNN, Anderson Cooper? 600,000. If they weren't paying, thanks to Tucker Carlson, we now know this, if they weren't paying airports to put CNN on their TV screen, they pay each airport about $150,000 to $200,000 a year to glue CNN, channel change to CNN. If they weren't in every airport, I think the viewership of Anderson Cooper would be he and his cousin. I think that'd be about it, right? So sooner or later, these things have to be, market forces have to dominate, with one exception. You look at things like the Washington Post. The Washington Post is Jeff Bezos' vanity project. There's no requirement for market forces to dominate there because when they're suffering, Jeff finds the loose change in his back pocket and throws them half a billion, and they proceed. So we don't want to censor. It's not who we are. You know what the answer is to CNN and MSNBC? You. You're the answer. Now, I know we have a population in this room that's slightly north of 30 on average. Slightly. And I'm going to say something that you may take personally, but don't, because it's about the cause. I don't care how old you are. I don't care how much of a technical klutz you deem yourself to be. If you aren't on social media every day, you are part of the problem. Sorry, you're not part of the team. Now, I overdo it a bit, according to my wife. I'm on Twitter and Facebook, for most of the waking hours of the day. But it's important, even though they're trying to throttle and censor us, there is a reason the President of the United States has 54 million Twitter followers. There's a reason. Because he's jumping across the heads of the fake news. He's communicating directly to the American people, just as he does at those fabulous rallies. And what we should all be doing is reinforcing the messages that he is spreading in terms of the founding principles, what's good for America. This isn't about party politics. This is about this institute's mission, first principles of the Republic. And you should be what we call in the military a force multiplier. So, I have a personal request to you. Personal request. By midnight tonight, all of you must have a Twitter and a Facebook account. Okay? And by the way, I know people who can check. Okay? So, I'm serious. Get on social media and talk about why America is special and why it should always stay special. Okay, last couple of questions. Do you disapprove of Trump's allegations of a rigged electoral system and the enemy media? Do these reflect an inefficient understanding of our time-honored system and our culture of free expression and the free press? I don't know who wrote this, but madam or sir, you are a victim of fake news. Okay? The president never called the press the enemy. Never called the press the enemy. It's not true. It is a lie. It is a lie. He called the fake news, the enemy of the people, which they are. Which they are. We have had 440 days of the Mueller investigation with insanity in the media. We had Chris Cuomo 4 days ago. Did you see this? Chris Cuomo actually had a segment where he talked about how the president, by mentioning the number 17 in one of his tweets, is secretly signaling to the QAnon conspiracy theorists. Chris, you're the conspiracy theorist. Okay, put your tinfoil hat on for the rest of your show. Okay? I mean, seriously. They are out of control. When they call a man who has created the most pro-Israeli administration since 1776, when they call him an anti-Semite, they don't get to call themselves journalists. These are not journalists. These are as much journalists as those two paid-for shill protesters at your dinner last night. Right? And my biggest problem is how people on the right, even in the White House, I saw this in the White House, how people on the right actually desire the approval of these people. They want to be friends with CNN, with the Washington Post, with the New York Times. I was treated as the weirdo in the White House because I only talked to about 6 journalists in my life, and they're all friends of mine. And I would not go on record or off record to the Washington Post or the New York Times. Why would I? These people are predicated on our destruction, and they hate the principles that we are fighting for. Why would I give them ammunition? So this is something that the right has to get to grips with, that we do not need the approval of a TV show with 600,000 viewers when more people, and I don't think Anderson Cooper will ever forgive me for saying this on his show live, more people watch Nick at Night Yogi Bear cartoon reruns than his TV show. Okay? And that's how we win. God bless you all. Thank you for coming, and stay the course. Have faith.